Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
Perhaps the most requested story of all time on my channel, and I'm kind of surprised because it's not that flashy. Headline: U.S. bans non-compete agreements for nearly all jobs. The Federal Trade Commission is at it again, and NPR.org is this version, but it was reported everywhere. In fact, I went and read the press release from the FTC, but that was rather dense, so I decided to not go with that. Andrea Hsu wrote this. The Federal Trade Commission narrowly voted this week to ban nearly all non-compete agreements, which are employment agreements that typically prevent workers from joining competing businesses or launching ones of their own, usually for a period of time, but we'll get into all the varieties out there and explain this in a second. The Federal Trade Commission received more than 26,000 public comments in the months leading up to the vote. The chair referenced them on Tuesday and talked about some of the stories she had heard from workers. She said, "We heard from employees who, because of non-competes, were stuck in abusive workplaces. One person noted when an employer merged with an organization whose religious principles conflicted with their own, a non-compete kept the worker locked in place and unable to freely switch to a job that didn't conflict with their religious practices." These accounts, she said, pointed to the basic reality of how robbing people of their economic liberty also robs them of all sorts of other freedoms. The Federal Trade Commission estimates about 30 million people, or 1 in 5 American workers, from minimum wage earners to CEOs, are bound by non-competes. I wonder if that number's accurate. That seems high to me. 1 in 5 American workers. But they say the policy change could lead to increased wages, totaling nearly $300 billion per year by encouraging people to swap jobs freely. And that, of course, could be true. That is that if somebody's stuck in a job that they can't leave because of a non-compete, the non-compete's there and they can go get a better job, well, then they can move up and someone else can take their place and so on. The ban, which will take effect later this year, carves out an exception for existing non-competes that companies have given their senior executives on the grounds that these agreements are more likely to have been negotiated. The Federal Trade Commission says employers should not enforce other existing non-compete agreements. Now, the vote was 3-2, so this was not exactly a slam dunk. The dissenting commissioners argued that the FTC was overstepping the boundaries of its power. One of them predicted the ban would be challenged in court and eventually struck down. Oh, I guarantee you it'll be challenged in court. In fact, what time is it right now? The challenge is coming. Whether or not it will survive court, I don't know. That is whether or not this rule will survive. But I guarantee you, in fact, I would carve this in stone. I often joke about how I can see the future. The Supreme Court will decide this. I guarantee you, because it's that big of an issue. And so unless a lower court strikes it down and the FTC just backs down, it's going up. For more than a year, the group, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, has vigorously opposed the ban. And they said it would sue the FTC to block the rule, calling it unnecessary, unlawful, and a blatant power grab. They say that non-competes are vital to companies by allowing them to better guard trade secrets and employees, by giving employers greater incentive to invest in workforce training and development. And this decision sets a dangerous precedent for government micromanagement of business and can harm employers, workers, and our economy, wrote the president and CEO of the U.S. Chamber in a statement that they released. That's the entire story. If you want to actually wade through the Federal Trade Commission press release, I invite you to do so. But it's some it's some deep wading you'll be doing, my friends. But let me explain one thing to you. A non-compete, generally speaking, is an agreement that usually an employer offers to you and says, look, you have to sign this agreement to work here. And in exchange for signing this agreement, you'll work here. And if you leave, you can't compete against us for a period of time. Often it'll be based on distance and time. So they'll say you can't work within 100 miles of this location for 5 years. Or they'll say you can't work in this industry for 2 years or something like that. Now, I want to make it very, very clear, though, that the first thing you have to understand is there are basically 2 types of non-competes. And one of them is very, very different than the other. So the most common type of non-compete that I can explain to you where it actually makes sense is, let's suppose that I've opened up a company and I sell widgets. but my widgets are so unique and so important and so cutting edge and so state of the art that people come from miles around to buy my widgets, Lehto's widgets, okay? And there's a line out the door. My e-commerce site is burning up the internet. I can't get widget materials fast enough. I can sell them faster than I can make them all day long and twice on Sunday. And you come along and you say, Steve, I want to buy your company from you. Don't you think it's time that you put your feet up, leaned back with a tall, cold Diet Coke, and just stopped worrying about business and money? I'm going to drop $100 million in cash in your lap. Sign the company over to me right now. Let me sell Lehto's widgets. $100 million. And that cold Coke does sound enticing, Diet Coke. And I say, okay. And you hand me $100 million, and I walk out the door. I put my feet up, drink that Diet Coke, and go, you know, I'm not thirsty anymore. You know what? I'm bored. I'm going to start a company. I'm going to start selling widgets. And they'll be known as Steve's Widgets. You got Lehto's widgets. I sold you the trademark. You got the name. But it turns out I know how to make widgets. And I open up a shop across the street from you selling Steve's widgets using my knowledge of the marketplace, my knowledge of everything. And everyone goes, oh, wait a second. That Steve Lehto sold Lehto's widgets and now opens Steve's widgets. I'm going to buy from him. Those kinds of stories have happened. For those of you in the guitar playing world, you know what I'm talking about. There are companies out there where some guy whose name was on the far end of the guitar sold the company to somebody, and a little while later realized, I don't like what they're doing with my guitars. And guitar players would know, oh, he doesn't own the company. Now he's got another company. But of course, he may have had to write out a non-compete, because that's what you do if you're smart and you're buying a company like that. So when you approach me and go, Steve, I'm going to give you $100 million for Lehto's widgets, you go, but you're going to have to sign a non-compete. And by the way, I've got friends who've done this. I have a couple friends who started a company in Michigan, and they were the first in Michigan to be doing a certain process in, let's just say, the medical device industry. It's something that people buy to solve a problem with their body. Let's just leave it at that. And they had that business rolling gangbusters. They were printing cash. It was insane how fast they were successful. And they showed up on the radar of a couple multinational companies who said, who are these upstarts in Michigan and what are they doing? And these guys came in and said, we want to buy your company. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to pay you a boatload of cash. However, we want the management team to stay in place for 1 year during the transition, and you guys got to sign a non-compete. You cannot compete with us for 7 years. 7 years. So my friends stayed on through the transition period, stood around and watched for 6 years as that company ran that place into the ground. Guess what they did? They started up another company with a different name, and everybody said, hey, they're back. We can go to these guys now. So the first type of non-compete I'm talking about is often referred to as being sold with the goodwill of a company. Goodwill of a company, of course, is a nickname for everything that comes along with the company, including its reputation and how it's known in the world. And so if I'm selling you Lehto's widgets along with the name Lehto's widgets, it would make sense for you to say, Steve, by the way, you can't sell widgets for 7 years. And for your $100 million, I'd sign that agreement. But I'd understand I can't get back into the business. So you have to understand when you do that, yeah, you're signing your life away in one respect for a period of time. But I've also known people who've sold and encountered the other kind of non-compete, and that is the one that comes as a term of employment. And this is a slightly different one because these fall all over the scale, okay? The most common one I'm aware of is where somebody goes to work for a company that claims they've got either proprietary secrets, lists of customers, lists of vendors, or some kind of knowledge that's not common in the field. So let's suppose you're a salesperson. You can sell anything. You can sell hot coals in hell, okay? You can sell ice to the people on the North Pole, okay? That's how good of a salesperson you are. And I've got a company that sells something. You've never sold it before, but guess what? You come along and go, Steve, I've never sold widgets before, but I can sell your widgets. I can sell your widgets all day long and twice on Sunday. And I go, okay, but before I hire you and hand over to you a list of all my suppliers, all my vendors, all of my outlets, because it turns out I got people I sell my widgets to wholesale, and a list of all my customers, before I reveal that to you, I want you to sign a document saying that if you work for me and I reveal all this information to you that is proprietary to me, you can't get this anywhere else out there, that you promise that if you stop working for me, that you will stay out of this field of widgets for a period of time. Those kinds of non-competes have been upheld by courts as long as they're reasonable with respect to time and the region or the area in which they tell you that you can't compete. So if you are, like for instance, a small business in a small regional area and you simply say you can't compete in my region for 3 years, a court in Michigan at least would have said that's probably reasonable because you can go to another region or wait out the 3 years. But if I said you can't sell anything for the rest of your life, a court would go, that's unreasonable. But I've known disc jockeys. Who've signed non-competes. And quite often they will say, if you come over here and, like, for instance, do the morning show, okay, the high-profile show on the station, you come over here and do the morning show. We're going to invest in you. We're going to put up billboards all over the place. Steve Lehto is back on the air. Steve's Morning Zoo, whatever the show is called. Big pictures of me as you drive down I-75. Hey, everybody, Steve's back. Okay? After you invest in me for a couple of years and I'm killing it in the ratings, somebody cross town changes formats and calls me up and says, hey, Steve, whatever you're making over there, we'll double it. We'll double your pay, come work for us. Now, if I go work for them to compete directly against the people who paid to put up the billboards, that does seem a little unfair. So I've known disc jockeys who've been asked to sign non-competes and say, you cannot compete in this marketplace for a period of time. And the question is, what's the length of time? But obviously, if I want to go down to, like, I don't know, Toledo or Chicago or New York, I'm not competing with a station that invested in me. So that would be okay. And so the courts tend to look at those as to how reasonable they are. But the other thing they look at is what do you get in exchange for it? Because remember, a non-compete at its most basic is a contractual agreement between two parties. And a contractual agreement is, generally speaking, something where both sides get something in exchange for something that the courts will enforce because it's fair. Most common contract is I walk up to you and go, I want to buy your widget for $10. You go, I want to sell you my widget for $10. You hand me the widget, I hand you $10. Boom, that's a contract for sale. So we're talking about a non-compete agreement. So if someone signs a non-compete saying, I promise you I will not work in this market for 3 years, what am I getting for that? Well, like the example I gave you, they're putting up billboards all around town, TV commercials, they're printing T-shirts. I mean, they'd say, yeah, we're going to promote this guy and turn him into a star. Obviously, if he then takes his star and his star power cross town to compete with us, that would be unfair. And a judge would say, I agree with that. The question happens, however, when somebody goes to work for a fast food restaurant at an entry-level job, they're right out of high school, and they go inside, they're being trained, and they say, oh, by the way, once we've taught you what all these pictographs mean, see, here is the trowel, there is the stuff you put inside whatever it is, whether it's a taco, a burrito, a bandito, or a roll-up. I don't know. And you trowel that into that, you wrap it in paper, and you hand it to the person in the drive-thru, and that's your job. Sign this agreement that says you will not ever go work for a fast food restaurant in this market for 10 years in exchange for working here. Now, I got news for you. The person who's doing the entry-level job where the entire description of the workplace can be done in pictographs, and by the way, I'm saying that on purpose. There's a book called Fast Food Nation where they talk about how there was a push in the industry a few years ago for simplicity in the workplace, and they actually said that many of these jobs can be reduced to non-verbal pictures, pictographs. And so my argument is, if anybody can walk into the street and read the pictographs and go, okay, I take the little garden shovel, I scoop up the meat-like substance and slap it in the tortilla, and I give it to the customer. Am I really being given such specialized training that now I'm more valuable and I can't go across the street and work at McDonald's? So that's the biggest problem for me. And so the Federal Trade Commission is onto something here. When you look at the grand scheme of non-compete agreements, it doesn't make sense, and I believe it is inherently unfair, to ask somebody at an entry-level wage type job to sign a non-compete that says, in exchange for work and here at minimum wage, entry level, you will not work at a competitor for 10 years. That's absurd. But if I am a company that has proprietary information and things like product lists and customer lists, things of that nature, and I'm going to train you and then give you all that information, and you can just walk out the door with it, I think it makes sense that I can ask you to sign a non-compete, at least in this region or in this field, for a length of time. And likewise, the non-competes that have to do with the goodwill and sale of a company. Those right there have to be enforceable, because otherwise there are some companies out there that you couldn't sell for full value. Because if I'm allowed to sell you my company and immediately compete against you just as long as I use a different name, there are going to be people going, I'm not going to pay you that much for your company, because what's to stop you from doing that? So keep in mind, I think it falls into three categories. It's the non-competes that are sold with the goodwill of a company. Somebody's buying a company, they buy the non-compete in essence. Then there are the non-competes that have to do with the people who do have access to proprietary information and extremely valuable information that they have to be given to do their job, but you wouldn't give it to the person if they could walk out the door with it tomorrow. That to me seems like that should be something that could be protected also. But to suggest that you can ask anyone to sign a non-compete in exchange for simply working at an entry-level job where they ain't learning trade secrets and they ain't getting the keys to the kingdom, all they're doing, like I said, is they're taking a garden trowel and slathering some meat-like substance into some kind of holder, and they're selling it for $2, $1.98 of which is profit, because the material cost, the stuff inside the thing, cost half a cent, and the paper wrapping it cost a penny. But that's another story for another day. I didn't say which fast food restaurant I'm talking about. But there's where we are. But I assure you that there will be lawsuits filed. I assure you that the courts are going to do the analysis similar to what I just did and say, well, they clearly make sense at some level with respect to the sale of goodwill of a company. But they certainly don't make sense at the other end of the spectrum. And the question is, where do you draw the line? And they already have some rules about what kinds of executives might be still held to a non-compete in the future, but it's based on like salary. And that's not necessarily the case either, because there are people who make lots of money at some companies that don't have access to the kind of information that would allow them to go out and compete against that company unfairly. And that's the thing, is there's some stuff out there that you might learn on the job that you would have learned on any job. So like I said, it'll wind up in court. It'll wind up at the Supreme Court. And the fight's going to be over those three things: the non-compete with the sale of the goodwill of a company, the non-compete with the person who's brought in and actually given proprietary information or proprietary training, or like I said, promotion for a disc jockey or a TV host or something like that. And then finally, the entry-level workers. And they're going to say this is obviously a whole spectrum, and the correct answer is in here somewhere. But it's not all and it's not none. I believe that the non-competes do make sense in some limited settings. So there you go. Thanks everybody who sent it. The basic story I talked about was from NPR. U.S. bans non-compete agreements for nearly all jobs. Andrea Sue wrote it. We'll see what happens. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. A theory on housework is, if the item doesn't multiply, smell, catch fire, or block the refrigerator door, let it be.